G'day, AJ Mahara here in this podcast video to tackle the question, how borderlines think. Wonder what that involves. Can be so confusing on the other side of somebody with borderline personality disorder, can it? Like so just crazy making, mind-boggling, head-spinningly not understandable. Let's get into it. To the question, how do borderlines think? Let me just first of all say, you probably know what I'm about to say, right? You do. No, let me just first of all say, not all people with borderline personality disorder think the same. When people recover, that's right, when they recover from borderline personality disorder, they don't think the same as they used to when they had borderline personality disorder. So how do people with borderline personality disorder think? Well, it depends if they are untreated, undiagnosed, diagnosed, denying, and untreated, or if they are getting significant treatment, or if they recover. Because when a person's recovered, they're no longer called a borderline, so how they think doesn't really fall under the purview of this question and answer. How do borderlines think? Borderlines don't think in interpersonal relationships when relating to people enough most of the time. What do I mean by that? Well, people with borderline personality disorder are often triggered, often flooded with emotions, often in dysregulated emotion. Very rarely are they in a space or a place inside of themselves where they are just logically, rationally thinking. So that's enough of a struggle for many at work, many who do work, many who go to university, many who are very educated, getting educated, very intellectual, right? Strong intellectually. But that's a different type of thinking. How do borderlines think? Well, first of all, they most often don't. And not every borderline is brilliant, but many are. The thing is, outside of that sort of thought process, borderlines aren't really thinking. So they're not really thinking most of the time that they're trying to relate. So how's a borderline think? Well, through their feelings. Distortedly, like a young child, often. People with borderline personality disorder are not thinking logically, cognitively soundly, mutually respectfully. Whenever they are in any kind of interaction with another person, interaction with somebody especially close, a family member, a cousin, a neighbor, a parent, or the adult child of, or whatever the relationship type, a husband, a wife, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, your partner, a same-sex partner, whatever the case may be, whether the borderline is a male or a female. People with borderline personality disorder are not actually, while in the process of relating to someone else, which essentially doesn't really come across often, they are not actually thinking while they're relating. They are feeling. Magical thinking takes place, which is really just people with BPD believing that what they feel is what is real. So that's why it's called magical thinking. It's not thinking at all. They have a lot of thought distortions. They have a lot of triggered, dysregulated emotion that affects the way they're going to perceive or misperceive what you just said or what somebody else said or what the conversation is about. When people with borderline personality disorder are, quote, thinking, unquote, and relating to at the same time, they're often, like I said, too busy feeling way too much, so they're overwhelmed, whether they show it or not, and their thoughts that might otherwise be logical are drowned out and become cognitively distorted and misperceived. And then magical thinking kicks in. So basically my answer in a nutshell to how do borderlines think? Well, interpersonally and interrelationally, they don't. They feel way too much. They misperceive. They project, projective identification, trying to seek self through other, etc., subconsciously, they feel. So when you want to know how is a borderline thinking when everything is so crazy making to you, or like you're swimming in confusion in your mind, like what just happened here? Why is he or she yelling now? Or why is he or she, why am I chasing them now to try to get them to say something to me? What happened? We were talking, everything was fine. I don't know. How is this person thinking? Well, the answer is they're not thinking. They are super feeling. And the super feeling doesn't necessarily, in fact, most often, have anything to do with what you were just talking about or trying to talk about, or the time you were sharing together, or the movie you were watching together, or the discussion you were having, or the interrelating that you were involved in, no matter what the subject. So people with borderline personality disorder do not have any emotional safety, are not emotionally mature adults. They are still, to some degree arrested unless until they get enough treatment. In early childhood, perhaps not stuck at 2 where the emotional arrested development happened, but, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, certainly not adult in their emotional reality. And therefore, when they try to think, emotions run roughshod over that often, especially in relating, because as I've said before, borderline personality disorder, among many other things it's called, said, and referred to as, is definitely becomes a relational disorder if it, starts out as a relational disorder as well. A client said to me one day with BPD that the most simple way that he could explain how he thought, or how he thought of others, maybe was the question, I'm not sure. He said that he thought people were disposable, and what he meant by that was that somewhere down the line, I'll fall out with those people, I'll end up talking to new people constantly because it doesn't work out with people, and all I know is when it doesn't work out or it's not going well, I'll rip them to shreds in an argument at some point. And then this client said to me, I don't form emotional bonds with people because I know they won't be in my life that long, and I know that my moods are extremely volatile. So in the same way that another person might think, kind of know what's happening from one moment to the next in a congruent way, these are my words now, this client said, people are just objects, and this is quoting a client, and I can get rid of them as quickly as they come, unquote. And I remember that client really well, because that client would go on to move on from that position, to grow and to change. But that's exactly how that borderline was thinking at that point in time, and had thought for some 35, 40 years of his life. And not realizing that, when he said, and at the time he said rather proudly, that he, or from a position of seeming power, he said, people are just objects, and I can get rid of them as quickly as they come. Because as he said, he could shred anybody in an argument. But you see, what he didn't realize, and I remember working with this client for a few years, and he got a long way, and is doing really well now. But back then, he didn't have any forethought or thought around the fact of how he felt. He didn't realize that his being able to shred other people in an argument really quickly, or that people wouldn't stay in his life and people were just objects, he didn't realize where that was coming from. And when he did, things changed. But that's how a lot of people with borderline personality disorder think. It's very young, it's very archaic, it's also very protective. It's much about right fighting. It's about they need to be right. And it's like people with borderline personality disorder need you, but they don't want to need you. They can't stand to need you. They don't trust you or themselves to need you. So you have to become this object along with object others I've mentioned in other videos, etc. But people with borderline personality disorder are not thinking in, a congruent, consistent, reasonable, healthy, expected adult way. People with BPD have low self-esteem. They're often fear-based and very shame-based. And they need control. They need to control as much or anyone around them. They need to control the environment. I had a partner years ago after I recovered from BPD. She had BPD, NPD, and was an alcoholic. We went to one therapy session together. It was a waste of time. But don't we all try something at some point, right? So she was describing to the therapist, she said, well, you know, I do have a tendency, just a tendency, she thought, to control environments. And the therapist was kind of like on board with that, responding back to that. And then I said, excuse me. And they both looked at me like, what? You mean you want to say something? And I just said, because it was supposed to be like couples therapy, I guess, but she took it over and it was hers. And so I was quiet. And I said, well, you know, I looked at the therapist. I said, you know that environment that she's describing, that she knows she needs to control? I said, well, the problem is not so much just that, but that I happen to be in that environment too. And so when she seeks to control, when she controls the environment, I feel very controlled. And it was interesting because she would talk away from that, and the therapist sort of like heard me, but that person I was with would talk away from that. And so that's kind of what happens often too. A person with BPD might have some awareness they need to control environment, or that they need to feel safe, or they might not realize the control aspect. But how they think about these things is just really from their own perspective, for sure. Like, or like when I had that, you know, that ex of mine from many, many moons ago said, well, you know, so benign sounding to a therapist, said that I went with her because she insisted on it, and like I thought, why not try once? I'm sure it won't help. Anyway, when she insisted that she was just needing to control the environment, what was wrong with that? There was no mention of the fact, you know, until I said something. She didn't, and then they never talked about it. I didn't say anything else, because it was obvious there was no point. But my point here is that she described needing to control the environment, but didn't say anything about the fact that maybe like I was in that environment often. So people with borderline personality disorder, how do they really think? Well, they think like young children. They often are feeling way more than they're thinking. And when they're trying to relate, they're trying to relate from a self not known. They don't know how they're going to feel from one minute to the next, which really affects how well they're going to be able to think or clearly think, or, you know, kind of be consistent at all in a conversation or from one conversation to another. And then, of course, there's that well-known way that borderlines think. Actually, it's borderline stinking thinking, but, you know, and misperception, etc. But you might think, and taking things personally, but you might think it's the way they think. As soon as you say something, you'll say something. You won't know what it is. You won't mean it the way that they're going to take it, but you'll just say something. And the next thing you know, they're off to the races. And what are they thinking at that point? Nothing. They're feeling all kinds of things. Like they can't believe you just said whatever you just said, because whatever you just said meant something entirely different to them emotionally than what you were trying to communicate, rather non-emotionally. Let me think of an example right now. Like if you said, well, you know, I find it difficult that we agreed that whoever cooked, the other of us would, you know, wash the dishes and clean up. And I've been cooking a lot lately, and I've been experiencing that, you know, you haven't been there to do the dishes or clean up, and I was just wanting to talk to you about that. And that seems reasonable, doesn't it? So what's the borderline thinking? Well, you're hoping they're going to respond to you. And people do this over and over and over with all kinds of different conversation, relation, whether you're just relaxing or it's this kind of a conversation. And then the person with BPD might say back something like, they might start getting defensive, getting louder, backing up, or getting quieter if it's quiet borderline. And they'll be like, What are you talking about? I never clean up. What do you mean you don't always cook? You don't always cook. Now, that's not what you said, is it? But they'll go, you said I've been cooking a lot lately. And they'll say, well, but you don't always cook. And then you might say, well, no, I don't always cook, but I've been cooking a lot lately. And I'm wondering why you're not doing the cleaning up part, for these last 6 days I cooked. Yeah, but you don't always cook. Like, you don't always clean up when I cook. See, this is how they think. But more to the point, this isn't how they think. This is what they're feeling. They're feeling like they just heard you say that you always cook. That it's a red herring, right? It's the way they're going to protect themselves from having to answer you because they're not really sure what you're saying anymore, because all they're hearing is not what they're not hearing what you said at all. They're hearing their version of it, or more to the point, their mother's version of it, or their father's version, something from the past version of it. And now it's like, well, you don't always clean up when I cook. You don't let me cook. You don't always cook. What do you mean you always cook? I cook. I know how to cook. I can cook for myself. And it'll spiral from there. And you'll be like, this is like just a one example, right? And you might then be like, wait, what? Wait a minute. Wait. I was asking why this person isn't cleaning up like we agreed because I've been cooking a lot lately. And then from there, they'll be like not only saying what they just said, this is the way they think, which in other words, decoded means it's the way they feel. It's the way they take everything personally. It's the way they misperceive and turn around what you say because it's triggering them like you're their object, other, parent representation, mother, father, whatever the case may be. And this happens really quickly for the borderline. It happens really quickly without them actually thinking about it. So I could give other examples, but just to keep this video short, many people with borderline personality disorder are not, they're not thinking like I said, they're really feeling. So when you wonder how do they think, their thinking is determined or directed or misdirected, becomes really dramatic and chaotic and often loud because they're reacting to what they misperceive. They're reacting to what they take personally and what you might just be trying to communicate in where you're just asking them to think, logically respond, and the conversation could come to a natural end. But it's not that simple with lots of people with borderline personality disorder. So I had a client once too that called himself a monster and said once that when he went into his monster self, I guess also his wife had called him that, but when he goes into his monster self, he felt like he could really literally feel a change in his brain. So see, was he anywhere near thinking? Not really. He was too busy feeling other things. He tries to have a conscious thought, and he's operating then just in flight or fight, and it's really exhausting. And so that would be largely what was going on for this client that I had. Whenever, his wife just might be talking to him about something like the example I just gave. And the other thing about how does a borderline think? Well, people think it's a weird question, right? Or they're not sure how to answer it, even if they have BPD. I had another client once who answered the question, well, what does it matter how I think? Because it's all effed up, and it's all distorted anyway, so why does it matter? It gets chaotic, I jump topics, I don't know what's being spoken about anymore. It just all pisses me off, or it all upsets me, or I'm always getting insulted. So all these kind of feeling statements to where whatever is spoken to many people with borderline personality disorder, they're reacting. They're getting triggered. They're emotionally reacting. They don't hear you so they're not thinking about what you said. They're reacting to it because they think that you've accused them of something. Lack of trust, lack of emotional safety, lack of known sense of self. And some people would say that people with borderline personality disorder, how do they think? Well, they can think like anyone else can think if their emotions aren't involved. Emotions are so often getting into the mix that people with borderline personality disorder in relating with others are thinking way less. They're not thinking very much at all, like they might be thinking that they are, and like you might be hoping that they're gonna. And then you might be wondering, why am I always getting thrown for a loop? Because every time I say this or that, or I try to talk about this or that, or what one of the kids needs, or what I need, or about lunch, or about dinner, or about we going here, we going there, we have to get to grow, about practical things in life even, if not just fun things. And the person with BPD is always getting defensive and always getting angry, always getting upset or withdrawing. So what are they doing? They're not thinking about anything you said. They're feeling it. They're taking it in, taking it personally, feeling accused, right-biting, unsafe, not trusting. They're reactionary. So really, in relating how people with borderline personality disorder think, the problem is that they really aren't able to think, that they aren't thinking clearly, that they aren't thinking rationally or logically, that they are emotionally driven by taking things personally, misconstruing them, misperceiving them, or being triggered by them, re-experiencing them as they might have in the past. So people with borderline personality disorder, in relating, in conversations, especially if they're difficult, but even sometimes when they're not, if you're just driving down the road in a car, you might ask the person that you're with who has BPD, whether you know it or not, a question. Next thing you know, you might just get bopped in the head while you're driving. I've had a lot of clients report that to me too. And the thing is, that's very dangerous, that's very inappropriate. And so you might wonder, what is the borderline thinking when they get reactive, like physically back to you, or hit you, or throw something at you, or scream at you? The answer is they're not thinking at all, and that's where the difficulty arises from. How does a borderline think? Let me put it this way. Another way that they don't think very often is how are you feeling? What's happening for you in the talk that you're having that's turned into a chaotic, dramatic argument, fight, or some other kind of chaos? The person with borderline personality disorder is again reacting, not thinking, and they are no longer aware due to their need for protection and all that they think is happening to them, and their right fighting and their defenses. They're thinking that you are attacking them, or they're reacting like you're attacking them. So yeah, I guess it's fair to say they're thinking that you're attacking them. So other than that, they're not thinking, they're feeling, and they're reacting, which is usually overreacting. Just a question to also put out here is, do you think that the person that you know, or that was your ex, or whatever the case may be, with borderline personality disorder, was ever thinking about what you were thinking? Or really ever thought much about, in the ways in which you thought about the things that you tried to talk about? Because usually the answer, if someone hasn't got any treatment, is no, because there's no meeting of the minds in these conversations in which people wonder, what on earth is he or she thinking now? Where did they go? What just happened here? So, what is a borderline thinking? How do borderlines think? Well, they pretty much, as I said, they don't think, they feel, and they feel quickly and deeply. They get triggered. It's some subconscious stuff. It's stuff from the past. They'll be thinking that they're not good enough for anyone. They'll be thinking a lot of thoughts that will lead them into the feelings of a lot of shame, a lot of fear, and a lot of mistrust. And might be thinking, why do I even bother? Why do I even try to talk to this person? Why do I try to have this relationship? So I hope that was helpful, because you can't try to make sense out of their emotions when you think they're reacting back because they're thinking about something, when really borderline thinking is such emotion-laden protection, emotion-laden attack, emotion-laden, did you just attack me? Said in many other ways, not a question. So borderlines aren't actually thinking that often relationally. They're usually really highly reactive from triggered dysregulated emotion, more often than not.